The setting sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets of Snake River, Wyoming, as Xander York stepped onto the wooden porch of the saloon, his spurs jingling with each deliberate step. The year was 1875, and like the frontier itself, Xander was hardened by years of unforgiving elements and even less forgiving men. At 32, he'd buried more friends than most, and had long ago decided that matters of the heart were best left to fools and dreamers. "Another night, another dollar," he muttered, adjusting the worn leather holster at his hip before pushing through the swinging doors. The familiar scent of whiskey, tobacco, and unwashed bodies greeted him as he entered the crowded establishment. Piano notes drifted through the haze of smoke, while card games and conversations created a symphony of frontier life. Xander made his way to the bar, nodding at the few faces he recognized. He wasn't one for unnecessary conversation. "The usual, Sam," he said, placing a coin on the scratched wooden surface. The bartender, a portly man with a handlebar mustache, slid a glass of whiskey toward him. "Heard you're taking that herd up to Cheyenne next week." Xander nodded, lifting the glass to his lips. "Weather holds, should be a good run. Might want to reconsider your timing," Sam said, leaning forward. "Word is there's been trouble along that northern trail. Rustlers hit the Henderson outfit just last week." Xander's eyes narrowed. Cattle rustling had been increasing in the territory, and the law was spread thin across the vast Wyoming landscape. "Appreciate the warning," he replied, though his plans remained unchanged. The cattle needed to get to market, rustlers or not. The saloon doors swung open again, bringing with them a gust of evening air and a commotion that drew everyone's attention. Standing in the doorway was Sheriff Mills, and beside him stood a woman Xander had never seen before. She was clearly not from Snake River, her clothing dusty but of fine quality. Despite the weariness evident in her posture, there was a dignity about her that seemed out of place in this rough-edged town. "Folks," the sheriff announced, his voice cutting through the momentarily hushed room, "this here is Miss Theodora Adams. She was on the eastbound stage that got held up outside of town. She'll be staying until the next stage comes through." Xander turned back to his drink, uninterested. Another Eastern lady passing through, probably on her way to San Francisco or some other city, bringing her city notions and delicate sensibilities to places they didn't belong. He'd seen plenty come and go, usually leaving with a newfound disdain for frontier life. "Mr. York," the sheriff called, walking over with Miss Adams in tow. "Miss Adams here needs somewhere to stay. Thought you might be able to help, considering you've got that spare room at your place." Xander nearly choked on his whiskey. "You're mistaken, Sheriff. I don't run a boarding house." The sheriff leaned in closer. "The hotel's full with that mining company in town, and Mrs. Patterson's got her sister visiting. You're the only option unless you want her sleeping here in the saloon." Xander looked at Theodora Adams properly for the first time. She was younger than he'd initially thought, perhaps 25 or 26, with auburn hair partially concealed by a practical bonnet. Her green eyes met his with neither fear nor desperation, but with a clear expectation of decency. "I can pay, Mr. York," she said, her voice steady despite her obvious fatigue. "And I assure you I won't be a burden." Something in her direct gaze made refusing more difficult than Xander had anticipated. Still, he tried. "Madam, with all due respect, I live alone for a reason." "The stage was robbed, Xander," Sheriff Mills said quietly. "Miss Adams lost nearly everything. It's just for a few days." Xander sighed, downing the rest of his whiskey in one swallow. Against his better judgment, he nodded. "Fine, but just until the next stage." The relief on Theodora's face was evident, though she maintained her composure. "Thank you, Mr. York. I'm grateful." As they walked the short distance to his modest home on the edge of town, Xander maintained a stiff silence. The woman beside him matched his pace without complaint, despite her obvious exhaustion. "I won't get in your way," she said finally, breaking the uncomfortable quiet. "I understand this is an imposition." Xander glanced at her, noting how the moonlight softened her features. "It's not proper, a woman staying with a man she doesn't know." Propriety seems a luxury when one is stranded in unfamiliar territory, she replied with a hint of dry humor. Besides, Sheriff Mills vouched for your character. Did he now? Xander couldn't help but be amused. Sheriff doesn't know me as well as he thinks. Theodora stopped walking, causing Xander to halt as well. Are you telling me I should be concerned, Mr. York? Her directness caught him off guard. No, madam, I'm just saying I'm not the gentleman the sheriff might have led you to believe. I've found that true gentlemen rarely claim the title, she responded, resuming her walk. And those most suspicious of kindness are often the most trustworthy. Xander's home was a simple affair, 2 rooms and a lean-to kitchen, built with his own hands over the past 5 years. It wasn't much, but it was solid and clean, which was more than could be said for many dwellings in Snake River. It's not fancy, he said, lighting a lamp as they entered. It's shelter, Theodora replied, glancing around with appreciative eyes. That's all anyone can ask for. Xander showed her to the small second room, which held little more than a narrow bed and a chest of drawers. It's not much, but it's yours while you're here. Thank you. She hesitated, then added, I'm afraid I have very little with me. The bandits took most of my belongings. Xander shifted uncomfortably. I might have a spare shirt you could use, and there's water in the basin if you want to wash up. After he'd left her to settle in, Xander sat at his small table, wondering what madness had possessed him to agree to this arrangement. He was a man who valued solitude, who'd learned the hard way that attachments only led to pain. Yet here he was, with a strange woman under his roof, disrupting the careful isolation he'd built around himself. He was still sitting there when Theodora emerged, her face freshly washed and her hair loosely braided. She'd changed into the shirt he'd offered, a simple cotton garment that hung loosely on her smaller frame. I hope you don't mind, she said, gesturing to the shirt. It's much more comfortable than my traveling clothes. It's fine, he replied gruffly, trying not to notice how the lamplight caught the copper highlights in her hair. Mr. York, I know this isn't ideal for either of us, she said, taking a seat across from him. But I want you to know that I truly appreciate your hospitality. Xander nodded, uncomfortable with her gratitude. How'd you end up on that stage anyway? Not many women travel alone out here. A shadow crossed Theodora's face. I was a teacher in Boston. I'm on my way to Sacramento to stay with my cousin. She's been ill and needs assistance. Long journey for a sick cousin. She's the only family I have left, Theodora said simply. Some journeys are necessary, regardless of distance. Something in her tone told Xander there was more to the story, but he didn't press. Everyone in the West had something they were running from or toward. Their reasons were their own. Well, you should get some rest, he said, rising from the table. Stage won't be through for another 4 days at least. Theodora stood as well, swaying slightly with fatigue. Yes, I think that would be wise. Good night, Mr. York. Xander, he corrected, surprising himself. If you're staying in my home, might as well use my name. A small smile curved her lips. Then you must call me Thea, all my friends do. We're not friends, Miss Adams, he replied automatically. Not yet, perhaps, she said with that same mysterious smile before disappearing into her room. Xander stood in his own small living area, wondering what he'd gotten himself into. 4 days. He just had to endure her presence for 4 days, and then she'd be gone, and his life would return to its carefully maintained solitude. But as he laid down on his own bed that night, he couldn't help but notice how the small house felt different with someone else breathing under its roof. Not necessarily worse, just different. It had been a long time since he'd shared a space with another person. 4 days, he reminded himself. 4 days, and then everything would go back to normal. He couldn't have known then how thoroughly Thea Adams would disrupt his carefully ordered existence, or how completely she would challenge everything he thought he knew about himself and what he wanted from life. Morning arrived with golden light streaming through Xander's windows and the unfamiliar sound of movement in his kitchen. For a moment, disoriented from sleep, he reached for his pistol before remembering his unexpected house guest. With a sigh, he pulled on his clothes and made his way to the kitchen. Thea stood at his small stove, deftly managing a pan of sizzling bacon. She'd already made coffee, its rich aroma filling the small space. "Good morning," she said without turning. "I hope you don't mind." "I thought breakfast was the least I could do to thank you." Xander grunted noncommittally, pouring himself a cup of coffee. It was stronger and better than his own usual brew, he noted with reluctant appreciation. "There's fresh bread too," Thea added, nodding toward a loaf on the table. "Mrs. Patterson brought it by earlier. She seemed quite surprised to find me here." Xander nearly choked on his coffee. "I bet she was." "I explained the circumstances," Thea said, her tone light but with an edge that suggested she understood the implications. "She seemed satisfied, though I suspect we'll be the subject of town gossip for a day or two." "Make that a week," Xander corrected, taking a seat at the table. "Not much else happens around here." Thea placed a plate of bacon and eggs before him, then served herself a smaller portion before sitting opposite him. "I suppose that's true of most small towns. Boston was much the same despite its size. People will always find something to talk about." As they ate, Xander found himself studying her. In the clear morning light, he could see the fine lines around her eyes, suggesting she smiled often, though she wasn't smiling now. There was a gravity to her that hadn't been evident the night before, a hint of something deeper than the simple story she'd shared. "What did you teach? In Boston?" he asked suddenly. Thea looked up, seeming surprised at his interest. "Literature and history primarily." "I was at a girls' finishing school." Xander nodded, trying to picture her in a prim schoolroom surrounded by proper young ladies. It wasn't difficult. She had an air of education and refinement about her, even dressed in his borrowed shirt. "Quite different from Snake River," he observed. "Yes," she agreed, a small smile finally emerging. "Though perhaps not as different as one might think. Young women are the same everywhere, full of dreams and questions and a desire to understand the world." "Not much to understand out here," Xander said. "Just survival." Thea considered this, her head tilting slightly. "I think there's a great deal to understand about survival, Mr. York Xander," she corrected herself. "It's the most fundamental human story, isn't it? How we endure, why we persist, what makes the struggle worthwhile." Her words struck an unexpected chord in Xander. He'd been surviving for so long, he'd forgotten to question why. What did make the struggle worthwhile? Not love, he'd abandoned that notion years ago. Not family, he had none left. Just the next day, the next job, the next cattle drive. "Deep thoughts for breakfast," he said gruffly, pushing back from the table. "I've got work to do. Will you be all right here by yourself?" "I'll be fine," Thea assured him. "Perhaps I'll explore the town a bit. I should see about replacing some of my lost items." Xander hesitated, then reached into his pocket and placed some coins on the table. "Take this, for whatever you need." Thea's expression shifted to one of pride. "That's very kind, but unnecessary. I wasn't entirely truthful last night. While the bandits did take most of my belongings, I had the foresight to keep some money in my boot." She smiled slightly. "An old trick my father taught me." Xander found himself unexpectedly impressed. "Smart man, your father." "He was," she agreed, a flicker of sadness crossing her face. "He would have liked it out here, I think. The openness, the possibility." Xander took his hat from its peg by the door. "Most folks just see the hardship." "Perhaps," Thea replied, gathering their empty plates. "But hardship exists everywhere, doesn't it? At least here it's honest." With that philosophical observation hanging in the air between them, Xander departed for his day's work, unsettled by how quickly this stranger had inserted herself not just into his home, but into his thoughts as well. The town of Snake River was already bustling despite the early hour. Xander made his way to the livery stable where he kept his horse, a sturdy buckskin gelding named Chance. The stable owner, Elias Cooper, grinned knowingly as Xander approached. "Heard you got yourself a house guest, York," the older man said, handing over Chance's reins. "Pretty one too, according to my wife. News travels fast," Xander muttered, checking his saddle straps. "Faster than a prairie fire," Elias agreed cheerfully. "Mrs. Patterson was practically running door to door this morning with the news. Said the lady looked real refined, like she stepped right out of one of them fashion plates." "She's just passing through," Xander said firmly, "waiting for the next stage east." Elias's bushy eyebrows rose. East thought sheriff said she was headed to Sacramento. Xander paused, realizing his mistake. West, then. Doesn't matter. Point is, she'll be gone in a few days. If you say so, Elias replied, not bothering to hide his amusement. Though I gotta say, York, might do you some good to have a woman around. Been what, 5 years since Sarah? Xander's face hardened. We're not discussing that. He mounted Chance in one fluid motion. I'll be back before sundown. As he rode out of town toward the grazing lands where his small herd of cattle was pastured, Xander tried to push thoughts of both Thea and Sarah from his mind. Sarah Blackwood had been his first and last attempt at allowing someone into his life. Their engagement had ended when she died of fever just weeks before their wedding. After her death, Xander had thrown himself into building his cattle business, working from sunup to sundown, leaving no time for grief or loneliness. It had worked well enough for 5 years. Until now. Until a green-eyed schoolteacher from Boston had appeared in his carefully ordered life. The day passed in the familiar rhythm of ranch work, checking fences, doctoring a calf with a minor injury, and meeting with a neighboring rancher about the upcoming cattle drive. By the time Xander returned to town, the sun was setting, painting the western sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. As he approached his house, he was surprised to see smoke rising from his chimney and lamplight glowing warmly in the windows. The sight was so unexpected, so domestic, that he paused for a moment before dismounting and tying Chance to the hitching post. When he entered, the smell of cooking food greeted him, along with the sight of Thea bent over his rarely used cookstove. She'd clearly been busy during his absence. The small house was noticeably cleaner, with a bunch of wildflowers placed in a jar on the table, which had been set for dinner. "Welcome back," she said, looking up with a smile that transformed her serious face. "I hope you're hungry." Mrs. Patterson was kind enough to share some vegetables from her garden, and Mr. Thompson at the general store gave me a good price on a beef roast. Xander stood awkwardly in his own doorway, unsure how to respond to this domestic scene. "You didn't have to do all this." "I know," Thea replied simply. "I wanted to. It helps me feel useful, and I've always enjoyed cooking." She gestured to the wash basin in the corner. "There's fresh water if you'd like to clean up before dinner." Still feeling oddly out of place in his own home, Xander did as suggested, washing the day's dust from his hands and face. When he turned back, Thea was placing a steaming platter on the table. "It's nothing fancy," she said, taking a seat, "but it should be filling." "It looks good," Xander admitted, sitting down opposite her, and it did better than anything he'd eaten in months. He usually made do with simple fare, beans, bacon, the occasional stew when he had time. This was a proper meal. As they ate, Thea told him about her day exploring Snake River. She'd met several townspeople, visited the small school, and even helped Mrs. Patterson with some mending in exchange for the vegetables. "Everyone's been very kind," she said. "Though they all seem quite curious about me and about you," Xander frowned. "What about me? About why a confirmed bachelor like yourself would suddenly take in a strange woman," Thea replied with a hint of amusement. "Mrs. Thompson suggested you might have had a change of heart about settling down, as she put it." Xander nearly choked on his food. "That's ridiculous." "I assured her our arrangement was temporary and born of necessity, not sentiment," Thea said, though I'm not sure she believed me. "Let them talk," Xander muttered. "They'll find something else to gossip about soon enough." They ate in silence for a moment before Thea spoke again. "May I ask you something, Xander?" He looked up warily. "Depends on what it is." "Why cattle ranching?" "How did you come to be here in Snake River?" It was a simple enough question, but one that few people bothered to ask anymore. Most in town knew pieces of his story or thought they did. "Came west after the war," he said finally. "Fought for the Union. Didn't have much to go back to in Pennsylvania, so I kept heading west. Worked as a cowhand for a few years, saved enough to buy my own small herd. Been building it up since." "And your family?" Thea asked. "Gone. Father died before the war. Mother passed while I was fighting." He shrugged as if the loss was inconsequential now. "Had a brother who went to California during the gold rush. Never heard from him again." Thea nodded, her eyes reflecting understanding rather than pity, which Xander appreciated. War changes people, she said quietly. My father was never the same after he fought at Gettysburg. So did I, Xander said, surprised by the connection. He spoke of it rarely, Thea continued, but when he did, it was with such sorrow not just for the men lost, but for the innocents that died there. He said no one who lived through those 3 days could ever see the world the same way again. Xander nodded slowly. Your father was a wise man. They finished their meal in a companionable silence that was surprisingly comfortable. As Thea rose to clear the plates, Xander found himself speaking again. My turn to ask a question, he said. You mentioned your father but not your mother, and you said your cousin is your only family left. What happened to the rest? Thea's hands stilled momentarily as she stacked the dishes. My mother died when I was born. My father raised me alone with help from my aunt, my cousin's mother. She passed away 2 years ago, and my father, she took a breath. He died last winter, pneumonia. I'm sorry, Xander said, and meant it. Thank you. Thea's voice was steady, but there was a depth of grief in her eyes that resonated with his own experiences of loss. After he was gone, the teaching position wasn't enough. I needed something else. When my cousin wrote about her illness, it seemed like a sign. A sign for what? That it was time for a change, she replied. Time to see more of the world than just Boston. Xander helped her with the dishes, an activity he normally avoided but found strangely satisfying in her company. As they worked side by side, he found himself noticing small details about her, the graceful movement of her hands, the way a strand of auburn hair kept falling across her cheek, the subtle floral scent that somehow persisted despite her travels. When they finished, Thea stifled a yawn. I think I'll turn in early if you don't mind. It's been quite a day. Of course, Xander said. Sleep well, Miss Adams. Thea, she corrected with a small smile. Good night, Xander. After she retired to the spare room, Xander sat alone by the fire, contemplating the strange turn his life had taken. Just 24 hours ago, he'd been a solitary man with a solitary existence. Now his house smelled of good food and flowers, and a woman's laughter had echoed off walls that had known only silence for years. 4 days, he reminded himself. In 4 days, she'd be gone and everything would return to normal. The thought should have been comforting. Instead, it left him with an unexpected hollowness that he wasn't quite ready to examine. The next morning followed a similar pattern, with Thea insisting on preparing breakfast before Xander headed out to work. This time, however, she had a request. I was wondering if I might accompany you today, she said as they ate. I've never seen a real cattle ranch before, and it seems a shame to waste the opportunity while I'm here. Xander hesitated. Taking her along would disrupt his routine, and he'd planned to ride the perimeter of his property today, checking for any signs of the rustlers Sam had warned him about. It's a long ride, he said finally, and not particularly interesting work. I'm a capable rider, Thea assured him. And I find most things interesting if approached with the right perspective. There was something in her expression, a mixture of genuine curiosity and determination, that made it difficult to refuse. Besides, he reasoned, it might be safer to have her with him than leaving her alone in town where the stage robbers might recognize her. All right, he conceded, but we'll need to find you something more suitable to wear than that dress. Within an hour, they'd managed to procure more practical attire for Thea, a divided riding skirt borrowed from the blacksmith's wife, and a sturdy jacket that had once belonged to the doctor's daughter. The town livery provided a gentle mare named Daisy, and soon they were riding side by side out of Snake River. The day was clear and bright, with a crispness to the air that hinted at the approaching autumn. As they rode, Xander found himself pointing out landmarks and sharing bits of information about the area that he rarely thought to mention to anyone. That ridge there marks the northern boundary of my land, he said, gesturing to a distant rise. Best grazing is in the valley beyond it. Water's reliable there, even in dry years. Thea listened attentively, asking thoughtful questions that revealed both her intelligence and her genuine interest. She sat her horse well, Xander noticed, with a natural ease that spoke of considerable experience. You've ridden before, he observed as they navigated a rocky section of trail. My father insisted, she explained. He said a woman should know how to ride properly, not just perch sideways on a saddle for show. A fond smile touched her lips. We used to ride in the countryside outside Boston every Sunday, weather permitting. He sounds like a practical man. He was, she agreed, but also a dreamer. He believed in possibilities, in second chances. Her expression grew wistful. He's the reason I'm making this journey. He always wanted to see the West, but never got the chance. They reached Xander's small herd around midday. The cattle, about 60 head in total, grazed peacefully in a lush meadow bordered by a clear stream. Nearby stood a simple cabin that served as shelter when Xander needed to stay with the herd overnight. It's beautiful, Thea said, surveying the scene, so open and free. It's not much compared to the big spreads, Xander replied, dismounting near the cabin, but it's enough. They shared a simple lunch of jerky, bread, and apples in the shade of a cottonwood tree. Afterward, Xander showed her how he checked the cattle, explaining the brands and the way he kept track of his growing herd. Each cow has its own personality, he found himself telling her as they watched a particularly stubborn heifer refuse to cross the stream with the others. That one there, the one with the white face, she's always been trouble. Got separated from her mother as a calf, had to bottle feed her myself. Now she thinks she's special. Thea laughed, the sound bright and unexpected in the quiet meadow. Isn't she? You saved her life, after all. Xander hadn't thought of it that way before. I suppose so. As the afternoon wore on, they rode the boundaries of his property. Xander kept a sharp eye out for any signs of trespassers or rustlers, but everything seemed peaceful. The only disruption came when they startled a family of deer, sending the graceful animals bounding away through the tall grass. Oh, Thea exclaimed in delight. They're beautiful. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and Xander found himself smiling more than he had in months. There was something refreshing about seeing familiar sights through her eyes, the way she noticed the beauty in things he'd long taken for granted. The pattern of clouds across the vast Wyoming sky, the way sunlight dappled through the leaves, the distant silhouette of mountains on the horizon. As they rode back toward town in the late afternoon, Xander realized he'd enjoyed the day far more than he'd anticipated. Thea's company had been not just tolerable but pleasant, her conversation intelligent without being intrusive, her presence somehow both stimulating and calming. Thank you for allowing me to accompany you today, she said as the first buildings of Snake River came into view. It was educational and quite lovely. You're welcome, Xander replied, surprised to find he meant it sincerely. They had almost reached town when Thea suddenly reined in her horse, her face paling. Xander immediately pulled Chance to a halt beside her. What's wrong? Thea nodded toward a group of men lounging outside the saloon. The man in the red bandana, I recognize him. He was one of the men who robbed the stagecoach. Xander studied the man in question, a rough-looking character with a scar across one cheek and a red bandana tied around his neck. He was a stranger to Snake River, one of several who drifted into town recently. Are you certain? He asked quietly. Absolutely, Thea replied, her voice steady despite her evident distress. I never forget a face, and his was particularly memorable due to that scar. Xander considered their options. They could turn around and return to the ranch, but that would only delay the inevitable confrontation. Snake River was too small to avoid anyone for long. Stay close to me, he said finally, and follow my lead. They continued toward town at a casual pace, though Xander was now acutely aware of the weight of his revolver against his hip. As they passed the saloon, the man in the red bandana glanced up, his gaze passing over them without any sign of recognition. He doesn't seem to have noticed you, Xander murmured. Perhaps not, Thea replied, keeping her face partially turned away. I was just one of many passengers to him, I'm sure, and I was wearing different clothes then. They made it past the saloon without incident and soon reached Xander's house. Once inside, Thea sank into a chair, the tension visibly draining from her body. We should tell Sheriff Mills, Xander said, hanging his hat on its peg. If that man was part of the stage robbery, he needs to be arrested, Thea nodded in agreement. Yes, of course, though, she hesitated. What if he recognizes me when I identify him? What if there are others from the gang in town as well? It was a valid concern. The stage robbers might well retaliate against a witness who could identify them. I'll go find Mills, Xander decided. You stay here, keep the door locked, I won't be long. He found the sheriff at his office, reviewing wanted posters. Mills listened intently to Xander's account, his expression growing increasingly grave. Been suspicious of those new fellows, he admitted. They've been flashing more money than drifters usually have, but without proof couldn't do much. He stood, checking his revolver. You say Miss Adams can identify the one with the scar, positively, Xander confirmed. Says she never forgets a face. Well, that's something at least, Mills sighed. Problem is, even with her testimony, it might not be enough. These types usually have friends willing to swear they were elsewhere during the robbery. So what do we do? Xander asked, frustration edging into his voice. For now, we watch them, Mills replied. I'll send a wire to the territorial marshal, see if these men match descriptions of known outlaws. In the meantime, Miss Adams should keep a low profile. No sense risking her safety until we're ready to make a move. Xander agreed with this cautious approach, though it meant Thea would likely need to stay at his place longer than the original 4 days they'd planned. The realization brought with it a confusing mix of concern and something that felt uncomfortably like anticipation. When he returned home, he found Thea had prepared a simple dinner. She listened attentively as he relayed his conversation with the sheriff, so I should avoid town as much as possible, she concluded, and the next stage isn't due for 3 more days. I'm afraid so, Xander confirmed. I'm sorry about this, you shouldn't have to hide. Thea shook her head. It's not your fault, and honestly, after today, I wouldn't mind spending more time at your ranch. It was peaceful there. The simple statement carried a wealth of meaning. Xander remembered how she'd looked riding beside him, her face animated as she took in the vast landscape, the way she'd laughed at the antics of a young calf. She'd fit into that setting with surprising ease. We could go back tomorrow, he suggested. I need to move some of the herd to the south pasture. It would be safer than staying here, and he hesitated. I could use the help. It wasn't entirely true he'd been managing the herd alone for years, but the lie felt justified by the smile that lit up Thea's face. I'd like that, she said simply. That night, as Xander lay in bed listening to the familiar sounds of his house now punctuated by the soft breathing of another person beyond the wall, he found himself contemplating the strange turn his life had taken. 4 days ago, he'd been convinced that solitude was all he needed or wanted. Now, the thought of returning to that solitude after Thea left felt unexpectedly hollow. It's just the novelty, he told himself firmly, the disruption of routine, nothing more. But as sleep finally claimed him, Xander couldn't quite convince himself that this was true. The next few days established a rhythm neither of them had anticipated, but both seemed to welcome. Each morning, they would ride out to Xander's ranch after breakfast, spend the day working with the cattle or maintaining the property, and return to town as the sun was setting. During these days, Xander found himself sharing more about his life and work than he had with anyone in years, while Thea revealed glimpses of her own past in Boston. I never intended to be a teacher, you know, she confided as they repaired a section of fence together, Xander showing her how to stretch the wire properly. I wanted to be a writer. What stopped you? He asked, handing her another staple for the fence post. Thea shrugged, a small, self-deprecating smile playing at her lips. Practicality, I suppose. After my aunt died, father needed the steady income that teaching provided. Writing is such an uncertain profession. What would you have written? Stories, poems? Both, perhaps, she replied, her eyes taking on a faraway look. I've always been fascinated by people's lives, the choices they make, the circumstances that shape them. The West seems full of such stories. Including mine, Xander asked, half joking. Thea looked at him directly, her green eyes serious. Especially yours. The simple statement hung between them, carrying more weight than either was prepared to acknowledge. Xander turned back to the fence, focusing on the task at hand rather than the unexpected warmth her words had kindled. As they worked side by side through the days, Xander found himself noticing small details about Thea that seemed to imprint themselves on his consciousness. The way she tucked stray hair behind her ear when concentrating, how her nose crinkled slightly when she laughed, the determined set of her jaw when faced with a challenging task. For her part, Thea proved to be a quick study, adapting to ranch life with surprising ease. She wasn't afraid of hard work and approached each new task with enthusiasm and intelligence. By the third day, she was helping herd cattle with a natural instinct that impressed even Xander. "You've got a knack for this," he told her as they guided a small group of steers toward fresh pasture. "Most city folks panic when the cattle start running. I believe in staying calm in a crisis," she replied with a smile, "and these creatures respond to confidence, don't they? They sense fear." "Most living things do," Xander agreed. In the evenings, they would return to town, where Thea would cook dinner while Xander checked in with Sheriff Mills for updates on the investigation into the stage robbers. So far, the sheriff had made little progress. The suspicious men continued to loiter in town, gambling and drinking, but committing no obvious crimes that would justify their arrest. Marshall wired back that our scarred friend matches the description of a man wanted for stage robberies in Colorado, Mills informed Xander on the third evening. "Name's Jed Harker, but without concrete evidence tying him to the Snake River robbery, we can't just arrest him." "What about the stolen items?" Xander asked. "Surely some of those could be identified." "Working on it," Mills assured him. "Got deputies quietly asking around at the saloons and boarding houses. If these men have Miss Adams's belongings or those of the other passengers, we'll find them." "And the next stage?" Xander asked, ignoring the twinge of something that felt uncomfortably like reluctance at the thought of Thea leaving. "Delayed," Mills replied. "Got word today. Bridge is out near Green River, won't be through for at least another week, maybe longer." The news should have been frustrating, but Xander found himself suppressing a surge of relief. Another week of Thea's company, another week of shared meals and conversations, of her presence brightening his austere existence. When he returned home and shared this information with Thea, her reaction was measured, betraying neither disappointment nor pleasure at the extended stay. "I hope my continued presence isn't too much of an imposition," she said as they sat by the fire after dinner. Outside, a light rain had begun to fall, drumming softly on the roof. "It's not," Xander replied honestly. "You've been helpful with the ranch work." It was an inadequate description of what her company had come to mean to him, but it was all he could safely offer. Thea seemed to understand what remained unspoken, a small smile playing at her lips as she turned her attention back to the mending in her lap, one of his shirts that had torn during the day's work. "I've enjoyed learning about ranching," she said after a moment. "It's so different from teaching, yet there's a similar satisfaction in it seeing immediate results from your efforts." Xander nodded, watching the firelight play across her features. "It's honest work." "Yes," she agreed, looking up to meet his gaze. "That's what I like about it." "There's no pretense out here, is there? A thing either works or it doesn't. A fence holds or it breaks. A calf thrives or it doesn't. There's something clarifying about that kind of reality." Her insight struck Xander as profound. It was precisely what had drawn him to this life after the chaos and moral ambiguity of war, the straightforward nature of survival on the frontier. Few people understood that, especially those from the East. "Most who come west don't see it that way," he observed. "They see only the hardship, the lack of comforts." "Perhaps they're looking at it from the wrong perspective," Thea suggested, "seeking what they left behind rather than appreciating what they've found." Their conversation drifted to other topics as the evening wore on, but Xander found himself returning to her words long after they'd both retired for the night. She saw the West, saw his life with a clarity and appreciation that was both surprising and deeply affirming. The realization was both comforting and unsettling, for it suggested a compatibility of spirit that Xander had not expected to find with anyone. let alone a Boston schoolteacher temporarily stranded in his small corner of Wyoming. The next day dawned gray and rainy, making the ride to the ranch impractical. Instead, they remained in town, Thea catching up on correspondence while Xander attended to business matters at the bank and general store. By mid-afternoon, they were both back at the house, the steady rain creating a cocoon of isolation that felt strangely intimate. "I've been thinking," Thea said as they sat at the table, a pot of coffee between them, "about what happens after I leave." The statement sent an unexpected pang through Xander. "Oh, yes, about my teaching specifically," she traced the rim of her cup thoughtfully. "I'm not sure I want to return to it even after I've helped my cousin recover. What would you do instead? I'm not entirely certain," she admitted. "But these days here, working outdoors, seeing tangible results from physical labor, it's made me question whether I belong in a classroom after all." Xander tried to imagine Thea returning to the confines of a Boston schoolroom after experiencing the freedom of the Wyoming plains. The image didn't fit. "The West changes people," he said quietly. "Yes, I believe it does." Her gaze met his, steady and searching. "Has it changed you, Xander?" The question struck deeper than she could know. "It's given me purpose," he replied finally. "After the war, I didn't have much direction. Out here, every day matters. Survival depends on doing what needs doing." "But is survival enough?" Thea pressed gently. "Is that all you want from life?" It was a question Xander had deliberately avoided asking himself for years. Survival had been enough, or so he'd told himself. Work, solitude, the simple satisfaction of building something from nothing. He'd convinced himself that wanting more was a fool's errand, that dreams and desires only led to disappointment. Yet sitting across from this woman who had so unexpectedly entered his life, who saw and understood things about him that he barely acknowledged to himself, Xander found his certainty wavering. Before he could formulate a response, a sharp knock at the door interrupted the moment. Sheriff Mills stood on the porch, rain dripping from his hat brim, his expression grave. "Need to talk to you both," he said without preamble when Xander opened the door. "Got a situation developing." Once inside, Mills explained that one of his deputies had overheard the stage robbers planning to leave town the next day. "They're splitting up," he said, accepting the coffee Thea offered. "Harker and 2 others heading north, the rest going south. From what my deputy gathered, they're planning another robbery before they go the payroll delivery to the lumber camp tomorrow morning." "You're going to stop them?" Xander asked. Mills nodded grimly. "Aim to. But here's the problem: I need Miss Adams to positively identify Harker and any others she recognizes before they scatter. Without that, I've got nothing solid to hold them on." Thea's face paled slightly, but her voice remained steady. "Of course. Whatever you need, Sheriff." "It's risky," Xander objected. "If they realize she's identified them, I'll have my deputies positioned throughout town," Mills assured them, "and we'll be discreet. Miss Adams can observe them from my office window. They won't even know she's there." Despite these precautions, Xander felt a deep unease about the plan. The outlaws had already proven themselves dangerous, and putting Thea in their vicinity seemed an unnecessary risk. Yet he also understood the importance of bringing these men to justice, both for Thea's sake and for the safety of the community. "I'll be with her the entire time," he stated, making it clear this was non-negotiable. Mills nodded, accepting this condition without argument. "First thing tomorrow then, before they have a chance to leave." After the sheriff departed, a heavy silence fell between Xander and Thea. The rain continued its steady drumming on the roof, but the cozy atmosphere of earlier had evaporated, replaced by a tangible tension. "You don't have to do this," Xander said finally. "We could ride out tonight, stay at the ranch until they're gone." Thea shook her head firmly. "And let them rob the lumber camp, possibly hurt more innocent people." "No, Xander, I couldn't live with myself." Her resolve didn't surprise him, though he wished it did. In the short time he'd known her, Thea had revealed herself to be a woman of principle and courage, qualities he admired even as they now filled him with concern for her safety. "Then I'll be right beside you," he promised. "The whole time." "I know you will." The simple faith in her voice affected him more deeply than he could have anticipated. That night, neither of them slept well. Xander found himself repeatedly checking his revolver and rifle, ensuring both were clean and loaded. Thea was quieter than usual, her normally animated expressions subdued by the weight of tomorrow's task. As they prepared for bed, she paused at the door to her room. "Xander," he turned, finding her looking at him with an intensity that made his heart beat faster. "Thank you," she said softly. "For everything, whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know that meeting you has been unexpected and—" She hesitated, then finished simply, "meaningful." Before he could respond, she had disappeared into her room, leaving Xander standing in the small living area, her words echoing in his mind. Meaningful? Such a simple word, yet it carried a weight of possibility that both frightened and exhilarated him. Morning arrived with clearing skies and a tension that hung in the air like the aftermath of the storm. Xander and Thea ate breakfast in relative silence, each lost in thoughts of what the day might bring. When they finally made their way to the sheriff's office, Snake River was just beginning to stir, shopkeepers opening their doors, early risers heading to the cafe for coffee. Sheriff Mills was waiting for them, along with 2 deputies. "Harker and his men are still at the boarding house," he informed them. "Usually head to the saloon for breakfast around 8. "You can watch from here," he added, gesturing to a window partially covered by a curtain that offered a clear view of the street and the saloon entrance. "What exactly do you need me to do?" Thea asked, her voice calm despite the circumstances. "Just confirm which men you recognize from the stage robbery," Mills replied. "Once you've identified them, we'll move in and make the arrests." "And if they resist?" Xander asked, the unspoken concern hanging heavily in the air. Mills's expression hardened. "Then we'll handle it. But you two stay here, out of sight and out of danger." They took up their positions by the window, Thea seated on a chair with Xander standing protectively behind her. The wait wasn't long. Within 20 minutes, a group of men emerged from the boarding house across the street, heading toward the saloon. Among them was the scarred man Thea had identified as Jed Harker. "That's him," she confirmed in a hushed voice. "The one with the red bandana." And the tall man beside him, he was there too. He held the shotgun on the driver. Mills nodded, making notes. "Anyone else?" Thea studied the group carefully. "The one with the black hat at the back. He searched the passengers, took our valuables." In total, she identified 4 of the 6 men as participants in the stage robbery. Mills exchanged a significant look with his deputies. "That's all I need," he said. "You two stay put. This could get messy." As Mills and his men prepared to make their move, Xander placed a reassuring hand on Thea's shoulder. She reached up, her fingers intertwining with his in a gesture that felt as natural as it was surprising. Through the window, they watched as Mills and his deputies approached the saloon. The sheriff entered first, while the deputies positioned themselves at the doors and windows. Minutes ticked by, the silence in the office growing more tense with each passing moment. Suddenly, the sound of shouting erupted from the saloon, followed by the unmistakable crack of gunfire. Thea gasped, her grip on Xander's hand tightening. More shots followed in quick succession, then a momentary lull before 2 figures burst through the saloon doors, Harker and one of his companions, both brandishing revolvers. "They're making a run for it," Xander muttered, instinctively reaching for his own weapon. As the outlaws dashed across the street, one of them glanced toward the sheriff's office window. Whether by chance or intuition, Harker's gaze seemed to lock directly on Thea. His scarred face contorted with recognition and rage. "That's her," he shouted to his companion. The woman from the stage. Before either Xander or Thea could react, Harker raised his revolver and fired toward the window. The glass shattered inward, sending dangerous shards flying around them. Xander instinctively pulled Thea to the floor, shielding her body with his own as more bullets splintered the window frame. "Stay down," he ordered, drawing his revolver. Outside, chaos had erupted. The deputies were returning fire, townspeople were scrambling for cover, and horses were rearing in panic at the hitching rails. Through the broken window, Xander could see Harker and his companion making for the livery stable, clearly intent on escape. Are you hurt?" He asked Thea urgently, quickly checking her for injuries. "No," she assured him, though her face was pale with shock. "I'm all right." More gunfire echoed from the direction of the saloon. Clearly, the other outlaws were still engaged with Sheriff Mills inside. "We need to move," Xander decided, calculating that their current position was too exposed if Harker decided to circle back. "Can you make it to the back door?" Thea nodded determinedly. Yes. Staying low, they made their way through the office to the rear exit. Xander checked outside before allowing Thea to follow him into the back alley. The sounds of the gunfight were still coming from the front of town, suggesting the sheriff and his men were still occupied with the remaining outlaws. "We need to get you somewhere safe," Xander said, trying to think clearly through the rush of adrenaline. "The ranch would be best, but we'd have to get to the livery for the horses." "Isn't that where Harker was heading?" Thea asked, her voice remarkably steady despite the circumstances. "Yes, which means we need another option." Xander surveyed their surroundings, considering and discarding possibilities. The church, it's solid stone and it's in the opposite direction from the fighting. With Thea close behind him, Xander led the way through back alleys and between buildings, avoiding the main street where the confrontation was still unfolding. They had almost reached the small stone church at the edge of town when the sound of hoofbeats made them freeze in the shadow of a storage shed. Harker and his companion galloped past, heading out of town to the north. They were moving fast, clearly prioritizing escape over revenge now that the element of surprise was lost. Xander waited until they were well past before continuing toward the church. The building was empty when they entered, the cool interior a stark contrast to the tension outside. Xander secured the heavy wooden door behind them, then led Thea to a pew near the altar, the furthest point from the windows and entrance. "We should be safe here until things settle down," he said, finally allowing himself to take a full breath. Thea nodded, the adrenaline that had carried her through their escape beginning to ebb. She was trembling slightly, though her expression remained composed. "Are you sure you're not hurt?" Xander asked, suddenly noticing a smear of blood on her sleeve. "Just a scratch from the flying glass," she assured him, showing him a small cut on her forearm. "It's nothing serious." Xander found a clean handkerchief in his pocket and gently bound the wound. As he worked, he was acutely aware of her proximity, of the trust implicit in the way she allowed him to tend to her injury, of the soft warmth of her skin beneath his calloused fingers. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "This shouldn't have happened. It's not your fault," Thea replied. "None of this is. I should have insisted we stay at the ranch." Her hand covered his, stilling his agitated movements. "Xander, look at me." He raised his eyes to meet hers, finding not fear or accusation but a steady calm that somehow managed to anchor him despite the chaos they'd just escaped. "I made my own decision to help identify those men," she said firmly. "And I would make the same choice again. Some things are worth the risk." Her words hung between them, carrying a meaning that extended far beyond their immediate situation. Some things are worth the risk. Was she speaking only of justice? Or was there another layer to her statement, one that addressed the unspoken connection that had been growing between them? Before Xander could respond, the church door opened, causing him to whirl around, placing himself protectively in front of Thea. But it was Sheriff Mills who entered, his left arm hanging awkwardly at his side, a bloodstain spreading across his shirt sleeve. "There you are," he said, relief evident in his voice. "Deputy saw you heading this way. Everyone all right?" "We're fine," Xander assured him, noting the sheriff's injury. "You're hit," Mills grimaced. "Caught one in the arm, nothing serious. Doc's already seen it." He moved further into the church, closing the door behind him. "We got 3 of them. Harker and one other got away, but I've sent riders to alert the marshal. With any luck, they'll be caught before they can get far." "And the payroll?" Thea asked. "Safe," Mills confirmed. "Their plan was foiled thanks to your identification, Miss Adams. You did a brave thing today." Thea accepted the praise with a modest nod. "I only did what was necessary." "Well, it's over now," Mills said. "Town's settling down. You two should probably head back to Xander's place, get some rest. Been a hell of a morning." As they made their way back through town, the evidence of the gunfight was visible in broken windows and bullet-scarred buildings. Townspeople were emerging cautiously, surveying the damage and exchanging accounts of what had happened. Several nodded respectfully to Thea as they passed, word of her role in identifying the outlaws having spread quickly. By the time they reached Xander's house, the events of the morning had taken their toll. Thea sank into a chair at the table, suddenly looking exhausted. Xander busied himself making coffee, his hands still unsteady from the lingering effects of adrenaline. "What happens now?" Thea asked as he placed a steaming cup before her. "Mills will send word when it's safe for you to continue your journey," Xander replied, taking the seat opposite her. "Until then, you stay here." Thea nodded, her fingers wrapped around the warm cup, and if Harker isn't caught, it was a concern Xander had been trying not to dwell on. Harker had recognized Thea, had clearly marked her as the witness who could identify him. If he remained free, she would be in danger. "Then I'll take you to Sacramento myself," he said without hesitation. "Ensure you get there safely." Thea's eyes widened slightly at the offer. "You would do that, leave your ranch, your cattle?" "Yes," Xander said simply, surprising himself with how easily the decision had come. "I would." A silence fell between them, heavy with implications neither was quite ready to articulate. Xander had just offered to temporarily abandon the life he'd built, the isolation he'd cultivated, to ensure Thea's safety. It was a significant departure from the man he'd been just a week ago, the man who had reluctantly allowed her to stay in his home for a few days. "Thank you," Thea said finally, her voice soft with an emotion Xander couldn't quite identify. "Though I hope it won't come to that." "So do I," he agreed, though a part of him, a part he was not yet ready to examine too closely, wondered what it might be like to travel with her, to extend their time together beyond the confines of Snake River. The rest of the day passed quietly. Neither felt inclined to venture back into town, both still processing the morning's events. Instead, they remained at the house, Thea reading a book borrowed from Mrs. Patterson while Xander cleaned his weapons and attended to small repair tasks that had been neglected. As evening approached, Xander built a fire against the growing chill. They ate a simple dinner, their conversation gradually shifting from the day's excitement to more personal matters. Perhaps it was the lingering effects of their shared danger, but both seemed more willing to reveal aspects of themselves they had previously kept guarded. "I've been wondering," Thea said as they sat by the fire after dinner, "about what you said before about the war changing you." "How did it change you, Xander?" It was a direct question, the kind he usually deflected or answered with a superficial comment. But something about the quietness of the evening, the soft glow of firelight on Thea's attentive face, made evasion seem pointless. "Made me wary of attachments," he admitted. "Saw too many men grieve for lost friends, lost brothers, some never recovered from it." He stared into the flames, memories surfacing that he usually kept buried. "After a while, it seemed easier not to form those bonds at all. And when you came west." Thea prompted gently, "Kept to myself, built this place focused on the work." He shrugged, "Convinced myself it was enough." "Was it?" Her question was soft, almost tentative. Xander looked up from the fire to meet her gaze. "Thought so until recently." The simple admission hung in the air between them, its implications clear yet unspoken. Something had shifted in Xander's carefully constructed solitude, and they both knew Thea was the cause. "I understand," she said after a moment. "After my father died, I threw myself into teaching, into helping others. It was easier than facing my own grief, my own uncertainty about the future." "Is that why you decided to travel west, to escape?" Thea considered this. "Partly, perhaps, but also to find something." "Something I couldn't name but knew I was missing." A small smile curved her lips. "My father always said that sometimes you have to leave the familiar to discover what you truly need." "Wise man," Xander observed. "Yes," Thea agreed. "He would have liked you, I think." The statement carried a weight of meaning that wasn't lost on Xander. A father's approval mattered, especially for a daughter as devoted as Thea clearly had been to hers. The implication that he would have earned that approval touched something deep within him. As the evening wore on, their conversation continued, ranging from memories of their respective childhoods to dreams they'd once harbored and then set aside. It was the most open Xander had been with anyone in years, perhaps ever. There was something about Thea that made such openness not just possible but natural, as if the walls he'd built around himself were nothing more than smoke that dissipated in her presence. The fire had burned low, the hour growing late when Thea yawned, the events of the day finally catching up with her. "I should get some sleep," she said, rising from her chair. "It's been quite a day," Xander nodded, standing as well. "Yes, you should rest." But neither moved toward their respective rooms. Instead, they stood facing each other in the dimly lit room, the air between them charged with unspoken words and unrealized possibilities. "Xander," Thea began, her voice soft but steady, "I want to thank you again. For protecting me today, for offering to take me to Sacramento if necessary. It means more than I can express." "No need for thanks," he replied, finding it suddenly difficult to maintain his usual gruff demeanor. "I'd do it again in a heartbeat." She smiled, the simple expression transforming her face in the firelight. "I believe you would." She hesitated, then added, "That's one of the things I've come to admire about you, your steadfastness, your integrity." The compliment caught him off guard, warming something inside him that had been cold for too long. "You make it sound better than it is. Most would call it stubbornness." Thea laughed softly. "Perhaps it's both." Her expression grew more serious. "But whatever you call it, it's rare and valuable. Like you." Before Xander could respond to this unexpected declaration, Thea stepped forward and placed a gentle kiss on his cheek, her lips soft against his skin. "Good night," she whispered, then turned and disappeared into her room, leaving him standing by the dying fire, his hand rising unconsciously to touch the spot where her lips had been. Sleep eluded Xander that night. He lay awake, replaying the events of the day, the conversation by the fire, and most of all, that brief, innocent kiss that had somehow managed to breach defenses he'd thought impenetrable. What was happening to him? A week ago, he'd been content in his solitude, convinced that emotional attachments were for dreamers and fools. Now, he found himself contemplating a future that included Thea not just for the journey to Sacramento, but beyond. The realization both exhilarated and terrified him. He'd built his life around self-reliance, around the certainty that depending on no one meant risking no loss. Yet in a startlingly short time, Thea had become important to him in a way he hadn't thought possible. Morning brought no clarity, only a heightened awareness of Thea's presence as they moved around each other in the small house, preparing breakfast and discussing the day ahead. There was a new undercurrent to their interactions, a tension that was neither uncomfortable nor unwelcome, but rather charged with possibility. Shortly after they'd finished eating, Sheriff Mills arrived with news. Territorial Marshal caught up with Harker and his partner near the Northern Pass, he announced. Both resisted arrest, neither survived. The news brought a complex mixture of relief and solemnity. Justice had been served, but at the cost of human lives, a reality of frontier law that was sometimes unavoidable but never cause for celebration. "So it's over," Thea said, her expression reflecting her conflicted feelings. "Yes, madam," Mills confirmed. "You're free to continue your journey whenever you're ready. Stage should be through in 3 days once they get that bridge repaired." After the sheriff left, a heavy silence filled the small house. The immediate danger was past, the path forward clear once again. Yet neither Xander nor Thea seemed eager to acknowledge what this meant for their unexpected companionship. 3 days, Thea said finally, her voice carefully neutral. "It seems both a long time and no time at all." Xander nodded, unable to articulate the confusion of emotions her impending departure stirred in him. "We should ride out to the ranch today," he said instead, focusing on the practical. "Check on the herd. After yesterday, I could use some open space." "I'd like that," Thea agreed, seeming equally relieved to have something tangible to focus on. The ride to the ranch was pleasant, the autumn air crisp and invigorating after the tensions of the previous day. They spoke little, each lost in their own thoughts, yet there was a comfort in their shared silence that Xander found himself savoring. The cattle were grazing peacefully when they arrived, undisturbed by the human dramas unfolding in town. Xander checked the herd quickly, finding everything in order, then suggested they ride to a spot he'd been meaning to show Thea, a high ridge overlooking the valley where his property lay. "It's the best view in the county," he told her as they rode. "First saw it 5 years ago when I was deciding whether to settle here. One look, and I knew this was where I belonged." The ridge was as magnificent as he'd promised. From its height, they could see for miles in every direction rolling grasslands, distant mountains, the silver ribbon of the Snake River winding through the valley below. Xander's ranch house and corrals looked small from this vantage point, nestled against a backdrop of cottonwoods and willows. "It's breathtaking," Thea said softly, dismounting to stand at the edge of the ridge. "I can see why you fell in love with it. Only place that's ever felt like home," Xander admitted, joining her. "After the war, I drifted for a while. Nothing felt right until I found this." Thea nodded, her eyes taking in the vast landscape. "It has a permanence to it, doesn't it? As if it's been here forever and will remain long after we're gone." She glanced at him. "There's something comforting in that perspective." "Never thought of it that way," Xander said, struck by her insight. "But you're right. Makes our troubles seem smaller somehow." They stood in companionable silence for a time, absorbing the panorama before them. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the valley, painting the landscape in rich golds and ambers. A hawk circled lazily overhead, riding the thermals in an effortless display of freedom. "I'll miss this," Thea said finally, her voice so quiet Xander almost didn't hear her. "The view?" He asked, though he suspected she meant something more. "All of it," she replied, turning to face him directly. "The ranch, the town, the work." She hesitated, then added with simple honesty, "You." The admission hung in the air between them, a truth finally voiced after days of growing awareness. Xander found himself struggling to respond, the words he wanted to say trapped behind years of carefully maintained emotional barriers. "Thea," he began, then faltered, uncertain how to continue. She smiled, a touch of sadness in her eyes. "It's all right, Xander, you don't need to say anything. I just wanted you to know that these days with you have meant something to me, more than I expected when I first arrived." "They've meant something to me too," he admitted, the words coming more easily than he'd anticipated. "More than they should have, maybe. Why do you say that?" She asked, her head tilting slightly in question. Xander turned back to the view, finding it easier to speak when not facing her directly. "Because you're leaving. Because this whatever this is between us doesn't have a future. You have a life waiting in Sacramento, and I have my ranch here." "Is that all we are, our circumstances, our commitments?" Thea stepped closer, her proximity making it impossible for him to maintain his emotional distance. "Xander, look at me." He turned, finding her closer than he'd realized, her green eyes searching his face with an intensity that made his heart race. "I don't know what this is between us either," she said softly, "but I know it's rare and I know it matters. And I'm not convinced our paths must diverge simply because that was the plan before we met." Her words offered a possibility Xander had been afraid to consider, that their unexpected connection might lead to something more permanent, that the future he'd imagined for himself might be rewritten to include her. "What are you saying?" he asked, needing clarity, needing certainty before he could allow himself to hope. "I'm saying that plans can change," Thea replied. "That sometimes what we find along the journey matters more than the destination we originally set for ourselves." It was a profound statement, one that challenged everything Xander had come to believe about the predictability and safety of a life kept simple and unentangled. Yet he couldn't deny the truth of it, or the way his heart responded to the possibility she was offering. Before he could reply, however, a distant rumble of thunder broke the moment. Looking west, they saw dark clouds building on the horizon, moving quickly toward them. "Storm's coming," Xander observed, his practical nature asserting itself. "We should head back to the cabin before it hits." They reached the small ranch house just as the first heavy drops began to fall. Inside, Xander built a fire while Thea prepared a simple meal from the supplies they'd brought with them. By the time they'd eaten, the storm was in full force, rain lashing against the windows and thunder rolling across the valley. "Looks like we'll have to stay here tonight," Xander said, peering out at the deluge. "This won't let up until morning, and the trail back to town will be too muddy and dangerous in the dark." Thea nodded, accepting the situation without concern. "It's cozy here, and after yesterday's excitement, a quiet evening away from town doesn't sound terrible." The cabin was indeed cozy, smaller than Xander's house in town, with just one main room containing a bed, a table, and a wood stove, plus a lean-to kitchen. It was designed for function rather than comfort, but the crackling fire and the sound of rain on the roof created an atmosphere of surprising intimacy. As the evening wore on, they sat before the fire, talking in the easy way that had become natural to them. Xander found himself sharing stories of his early days on the ranch, the challenges, the mistakes, the small triumphs that had kept him going through difficult times. "First winter was the hardest," he recalled. "Lost 6 head to the cold, nearly froze myself a couple times. Thought about giving up, heading back east or maybe to California where the weather's milder, but something kept me here." He gazed into the fire. "Stubbornness, maybe, or perhaps a recognition that this was where you belonged," Thea suggested. "That despite the hardships, this land spoke to something in you." Xander nodded slowly, struck again by her ability to understand him, to articulate feelings he'd never fully examined himself. "Maybe so." The fire burned lower as the hour grew late. Outside, the storm continued unabated, rain drumming steadily on the roof. Inside, a comfortable drowsiness had settled over them both, the events of the past few days and the emotional revelations of the afternoon taking their toll. "We should try to get some sleep," Xander said finally, conscious of the single bed in the corner. "You take the bed, I'll make do here by the fire." Thea looked as if she might protest, then nodded. "Wake me if you get uncomfortable, we can trade." She retired to the bed while Xander arranged blankets near the stove, creating a makeshift pallet that wasn't entirely uncomfortable. For a time, the only sounds were the crackling of the fire, the patter of rain, and the occasional rumble of thunder, now more distant as the storm moved eastward. Xander was drifting toward sleep when Thea's voice came softly through the darkness. "Xander, are you awake?" "Yes," he replied, turning toward the sound of her voice. In the dim light from the banked fire, he could just make out her form sitting up in the bed. "I can't sleep," she admitted. "Too many thoughts?" "About what happened in town yesterday?" he asked. "No." There was a pause. "About what we were discussing on the ridge before the storm came." Xander sat up, suddenly fully alert. "What about it?" "I meant what I said," Thea continued, her voice quiet but steady. "About plans changing, about finding unexpected things along the journey." "I know you did," Xander replied, his heart beating faster. "I've been thinking about it too." "And?" The single word held a world of question. Xander took a deep breath, gathering courage for what he needed to say. "And I'm not sure what happens next. I've spent 5 years building a life of solitude, convincing myself it was what I wanted. Then you arrived, and in a week, you've made me question everything I thought I knew about myself." "Is that a bad thing?" Thea asked gently. "No," Xander admitted, surprising himself with the certainty of his answer. "Uncomfortable, maybe, frightening, definitely, but not bad." A silence fell between them, heavy with unspoken possibilities. Then, to Xander's surprise, he heard the rustle of blankets as Thea rose from the bed and moved toward him. She settled beside him on the pallet, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her presence but not touching. "I'm frightened too," she confessed softly. "I've always had a plan, a clear path forward. Even coming west was part of plan help my cousin, perhaps teach in Sacramento afterward. I never expected to find." She hesitated. "To find someone who makes me reconsider everything." "What are we doing, Thea?" Xander asked, the question encompassing far more than their current proximity. "I don't know," she replied honestly, "but I think we're discovering that some chances are worth taking, even when the outcome isn't certain." The simplicity and truth of her words resonated deeply with Xander. All his life, especially since the war, he'd sought certainty, control, the elimination of risk. Yet here was Thea, suggesting that uncertainty might be worth embracing if it meant the possibility of something meaningful, something real. Outside, the storm had begun to abate, the thunder now a distant rumble, the rain softening to a gentle patter. Inside, a different kind of storm was brewing, one of emotion and possibility, of barriers falling and new horizons opening. "Come here," Xander said softly, extending his arm in invitation. Thea moved closer, nestling against his side as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Xander wrapped his arm around her shoulders, marveling at how right it felt to hold her, how perfectly she fit against him. They sat like that in comfortable silence, watching the dying embers of the fire. Gradually, Thea's head grew heavier against his shoulder, her breathing deepening as sleep began to claim her. Xander remained awake, savoring the weight of her against him, the trust implicit in her relaxed form. This was what had been missing from his carefully constructed life, he realized. Not just companionship, but this specific connection with this specific woman, a woman who challenged him, understood him, saw value in him beyond his utility or strength. As Thea slept peacefully on his shoulder, Xander made a decision. When morning came, when they returned to town, he would ask her to stay not just for a few more days, but permanently. The thought was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure, but for the first time in years, the possibility of joy seemed worth the risk of pain. With this resolution firm in his mind, Xander finally allowed himself to drift toward sleep. Thea warm and solid against him, the storm outside giving way to a clear, promising dawn. Morning arrived with brilliant sunshine streaming through the cabin windows, the storm having cleared the air to a crystalline purity. Xander awoke to find Thea still nestled against him, her auburn hair spilling across his chest, her face peaceful in sleep. For a moment, he simply watched her, marveling at the turn his life had taken in such a short time. When she finally stirred, blinking up at him with sleepy green eyes, Xander felt a surge of affection so powerful it momentarily robbed him of speech. "Good morning," Thea murmured, a soft smile curving her lips. "I seem to have used you as a pillow all night. I hope you weren't too uncomfortable." "Not at all," Xander assured her, his voice rough with emotion and sleep. "Best night's rest I've had in years." Thea's smile widened at this, a hint of color touching her cheeks as she sat up, smoothing her rumpled hair. "The storm has passed," she observed, glancing toward the window where sunlight poured in. "Yes," Xander agreed, though his mind was on storms of a different kind, the emotional tempest that had been building between them, the decision he'd made in the quiet hours of the night. They prepared a simple breakfast together, moving around the small cabin with an ease that spoke of a deeper familiarity than their short acquaintance would suggest. As they ate, Xander found himself watching Thea, trying to find the right words for what he wanted to say. "You're very quiet this morning," she observed finally, her perceptive gaze meeting his across the table. Second thoughts, the directness of the question was so typically Thea that Xander couldn't help but smile. "No," he replied honestly. "The opposite, in fact." Setting down his coffee cup, he reached across the table to take her hand in his. "Thea, I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about plans changing, about finding unexpected things along the journey." She nodded, her expression attentive, a hint of hope visible in her eyes. "I've spent 5 years convincing myself that solitude was enough," Xander continued, the words coming more easily than he'd anticipated. That emotional attachments were dangerous, that caring for someone only led to pain when they inevitably left or were taken away. "A natural conclusion given what you experienced in the war," Thea said softly. "Maybe so, but it was also a way of hiding, of avoiding risk." He tightened his grip on her hand slightly. "Then you came along, and in a week, you've made me question everything I thought I knew about what I want from life." "And what do you want, Xander?" Thea asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You," he said simply. "I want you to stay, Thea, not just for a few more days or weeks, but..." "Permanently?" The words hung in the air between them, a declaration that could not be taken back, a risk Xander would have considered unthinkable just days ago. Yet now, looking into Thea's luminous eyes, he felt no regret, only a certainty that surprised him with its strength. "Are you asking me to marry you, Xander York?" Thea asked, her tone serious but with a warmth that gave him courage. "Yes," he replied, surprised again by how easily the answer came. "I know it's sudden, I know we've known each other only a short time. But I also know that what's between us is real and rare, and I don't want to lose you because I was too afraid to reach for happiness when it was right in front of me." Thea's eyes filled with tears, but her smile was radiant. How can a man who claims to be uncomfortable with words express himself so beautifully? She wondered aloud. Leaning across the table, she placed her free hand against his cheek. "Yes, Xander, I'll stay, I'll marry you." The simple acceptance, offered without hesitation or qualification, filled Xander with a joy he hadn't believed possible. Acting on instinct rather than thought, he rose from his chair, drawing Thea up with him and into his arms. Their first kiss was tentative at first, a gentle exploration that quickly deepened as long-suppressed emotions found expression. Thea's arms wound around his neck, her body pressing against his with a trust and passion that awakened feelings Xander had thought long dead. When they finally broke apart, both slightly breathless, Xander rested his forehead against hers, unwilling to increase the distance between them even by inches. "I never thought I'd find this," he admitted quietly. "Never thought I'd want it again after Sarah died." Thea drew back slightly, her expression questioning. "Sarah, we were engaged before the war," Xander explained, finding it easier than expected to speak of his long-ago loss. "She died of fever while I was fighting at Gettysburg. By the time I got the letter telling me, she'd been buried for weeks." Understanding and compassion filled Thea's eyes. "I'm so sorry, Xander. No wonder you've been wary of attachments." "For a long time, I believed loving someone was just asking for pain," he continued. "But you've shown me that the alternative, living without love, is its own kind of pain, one that's constant rather than occasional, and with no moments of joy to balance it." "That's a profound realization," Thea said softly. "I'm learning," Xander replied with a small smile. "Having a schoolteacher around seems to be educational," Thea laughed, the sound bright and joyful in the sunlit cabin. "Well, I hope you're prepared for a lifetime of learning then, Mr. York." "Looking forward to it, Miss Adams," he replied, drawing her close for another kiss. The ride back to town that morning was filled with a shared excitement and occasional bursts of laughter as they discussed their sudden change in plans. Practical matters would need to be addressed. Thea would have to send word to her cousin in Sacramento, explaining her decision to stay in Wyoming. Arrangements for a proper wedding would need to be made, though neither wanted to wait long. "Mrs. Patterson will be insufferably pleased with herself," Thea noted with amusement as they approached Snake River. "She hinted rather strongly yesterday that you were a fine man who'd been alone too long." "Did she now?" Xander raised an eyebrow. "And what did you say to that?" "That you seemed perfectly content with your solitude," Thea replied with a mischievous smile, "and that some men prefer independence to domestic comforts." "And now?" Xander asked, guiding Chance alongside her mare. "Now I'll have to admit she was right," Thea conceded with a laugh. "Though I maintain it had nothing to do with her matchmaking efforts and everything to do with unexpected circumstances and genuine connection." Their announcement was met with varying degrees of surprise and delight from the townspeople of Snake River. Sheriff Mills offered hearty congratulations, Mrs. Patterson beamed with satisfaction, and Sam the bartender insisted on providing whiskey for a celebratory toast at the saloon, a venue Thea entered for the first time, causing quite a stir among the regular patrons. Over the next few days, preparations for both the wedding and their future together proceeded at a pace that might have seemed rushed to outsiders, but felt perfectly natural to them. Thea sent a letter to her cousin, explaining her change in plans and promising to visit Sacramento in the future. Xander made arrangements with the minister, and together they discussed how to adapt his house to accommodate a wife rather than a temporary guest. It's small, Xander acknowledged as they surveyed the modest dwelling. We could build something larger, closer to town perhaps, if you'd prefer. Thea shook her head decisively. I like this house. You built it with your own hands and it has character, she smiled, touching his arm gently. Besides, we can always expand it as needed, perhaps add another room or two. The implication of children, a family, was not lost on Xander. It was a possibility he hadn't allowed himself to consider for years, yet now, with Thea, it seemed not just possible but desirable. As many rooms as you want, he promised, wrapping an arm around her waist. This is your home now, too. The wedding took place on a crisp October morning, with the aspens turning gold against the clear blue Wyoming sky. It was a simple ceremony, attended by most of Snake River's residents, who had quickly embraced Thea as one of their own. She wore a dress of pale blue silk, a wedding gift from the women of the town, who had pooled resources to order it from Cheyenne, and carried a bouquet of late-blooming wildflowers gathered from the ridge where Xander had first shown her the view of his ranch. Xander, unaccustomed to formal attire, wore his best shirt and a new vest, his usually unruly hair tamed for the occasion. As he watched Thea walk toward him down the short aisle of the small church, he was struck again by the remarkable turn his life had taken. How this woman, initially an unwelcome disruption to his solitary existence, had become essential to his happiness in ways he'd never imagined possible. Their vows were straightforward and heartfelt, a promise to honor and cherish each other through whatever challenges life might bring. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, and Xander kissed his bride to the applause of the gathered townspeople, he felt a sense of rightness and belonging that had eluded him since before the war. The celebration that followed lasted well into the evening, with food and music and dancing in the town square. As night fell, lanterns were lit, casting a warm glow over the festivities. Xander, never one for dancing, found himself willingly led into a waltz by his new wife, her happiness so infectious that his usual self-consciousness fell away. "Happy, Mrs. York?" he asked as they moved together to the music, her head resting comfortably against his shoulder. "Incredibly so," Thea replied, looking up at him with a smile that still had the power to quicken his pulse. "And you, Mr. York, any regrets about abandoning your solitary ways?" "Not a single one," he assured her, tightening his arm around her waist. "Best decision I ever made, letting the sheriff talk me into taking in a stranded traveler." As the celebration wound down and well-wishers began to depart, Xander and Thea made their way home through the quiet streets of Snake River. The night was clear, stars blazing overhead in a display that still had the power to awe Xander despite his years on the frontier. "It's beautiful," Thea murmured, her head tilted back to take in the celestial panorama. "I never saw stars like this in Boston. Too many buildings, too many lamps." "One of the things I love about the West," Xander agreed. "Reminds you how small we all are, how vast the world is beyond our immediate concerns." They reached their home, now truly theirs, together, and Xander lifted Thea across the threshold, an old tradition his mother had once mentioned that seemed appropriate for this new beginning. Inside, the house was warm and welcoming, a fire already laid in the hearth by Mrs. Patterson, who had insisted on preparing the home for the newlyweds' return. As they stood together in the firelight, husband and wife at last, Xander was struck by how dramatically his life had changed in the space of 2 weeks. From a man who believed love was for dreamers to a man whose heart was full to overflowing, it was a transformation he could never have predicted or imagined. "What are you thinking?" Thea asked, noting his thoughtful expression. "That I'm the luckiest man in Wyoming," Xander replied honestly. "And that I never thought I'd feel this way again or at all." Thea's expression softened, her hand rising to touch his cheek. "I think perhaps we're both fortunate to have found each other, to have recognized what was happening between us before it was too late." "Before you got on that stage to Sacramento," Xander agreed. "Before you convinced yourself that solitude was all you needed," Thea added with a gentle smile. They moved toward each other simultaneously. The kiss they shared carrying all the promise of their new life together, tender yet passionate, comfortable yet exciting, a perfect balance of what they'd been and what they were becoming together. Later, as they lay together in the quiet darkness, Thea's head resting on Xander's shoulder just as it had that night in the cabin, he reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. How a stagecoach robbery, an inconvenient storm, and a woman falling asleep on his shoulder had changed everything he thought he knew about himself and what he wanted from life. "Xander," Thea's voice was soft in the darkness. He tightened his arm around her, drawing her closer. "I was just thinking about fate, about chances and choices." She propped herself up on one elbow, her face dimly visible in the moonlight streaming through the window. "Do you believe that some things are meant to be? That we might have found each other even without the stage robbery, without the sheriff bringing me to your door?" Xander considered this, his hand idly stroking her hair. "I don't know about fate," he said finally. "But I do believe that life offers opportunities and it's up to us to recognize and act on them. Some people do, some don't." He smiled up at her. "I'm grateful every day that you had the courage to see what was happening between us, to speak of it when I might have remained silent out of fear or habit." "It wasn't courage so much as necessity," Thea confessed. "The thought of leaving, of never seeing you again, was suddenly unbearable. I had to say something, even if you didn't feel the same way." "But I did," Xander assured her. "I just didn't know how to express it, how to bridge the gap between what I'd always believed about myself and what I was beginning to feel for you. And now?" Thea asked, her expression serious in the dim light. "Now I believe that some dreams are worth pursuing," Xander replied, pulling her down for a gentle kiss. "And that love isn't just for dreamers after all." The years that followed proved the truth of this revelation many times over. Xander and Thea built a life together that was richer and more fulfilling than either had imagined possible. The small ranch prospered under their joint care, expanding gradually as their family grew, first with the birth of their son, Daniel, 2 years after their marriage, followed by twin daughters, Emily and Alina, 3 years later. Thea never did continue to Sacramento, though she and Xander made the journey together several times to visit her cousin, who recovered from her illness and eventually moved to San Francisco. Thea's teaching skills found use in Snake River's growing school, where she taught part-time while raising their children and helping with the ranch. And Xander, once so committed to his solitude, discovered that a house filled with family, with laughter and occasional chaos, with love and minor disagreements, with the everyday miracle of shared lives, was infinitely preferable to the quiet emptiness he'd once mistaken for peace. On the 10th anniversary of their meeting, Xander took Thea back to the ridge where he'd first shown her the view of his ranch, now their ranch, substantially expanded and thriving. They sat together on their horses, looking out over the land that had become so much more than property to both of them. "Any regrets?" Xander asked, echoing the question Thea had posed on their wedding night a decade earlier. "Not a single one," she replied with the smile that still had the power to warm him from within. "You," Xander shook his head, reaching across to take her hand in his. "Only that I wasted so many years believing that dreams weren't worth having, if I'd known what was waiting for me." "You found it when you were ready," Thea said simply, "when we both were." As they rode home together, toward the house that had grown along with their family, toward the life they'd built from an unexpected beginning, Xander reflected on how completely his perspective had changed. Love wasn't for dreamers, as he'd once believed. It was for those brave enough to wake up, to see the possibilities life offered, and to reach for them with open hearts. And in that, he'd discovered, lay the greatest adventure of all.